So if you missed that and want to go back and take a look, it is on the Pure Water Partners website. All right, any questions before we move on? All right, I just want to introduce the members of the team that helped to put the workshop together, and we all will be around at the end for questions. So if you just want to wave when I introduce you, that would be great. So we have Jen Weber with the McKenzie Watershed Council, Lily Leiterman with the Upper Willamette Soil and Water Conservation District, Chris Stenchel with EWEB, wave Chris, and Justin Patton with ODF, or Oregon Department of Forestry, sorry. I will try not to use too many acronyms. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and share my screen and see what happens. All right, give me a thumbs up if that looks good. Okay. All right, so as I mentioned, this is part 2 of the Naturescaping workshop. We divided it up into 2 different Tuesdays, so we wouldn't have you on Zoom for like 3 hours. So tonight we're going to be talking about Firewise landscaping in particular, and then some naturescaping basic principles and site design and decisions about what plants to plant where. Just as a brief intro, I'm not going to do the whole presentation that I did last week, so I'll do a really shortened version of it. So again, EWEB has had a drinking water source protection program in place since 2001, and we are aiming to protect the McKenzie River as Eugene's sole source of drinking water, and also recognizing that a lot of residents get their drinking water from wells that are very close to the McKenzie River. And we're basically looking to balance watershed health with human use over time and implement programs and actions that protect the McKenzie River by making investments in upriver portions of our watershed. So last week I talked about some of the threats to water quality, one of them being cumulative development over time in riparian and floodplain areas. And so one of the things we want to promote is healthy riparian areas and floodplains because of the critical water quality functions that they provide. So a large one is buffering chemical runoff from farms, forests, and residences. So that's any kind of chemical or fertilizer that's sprayed on and can run off during storm events into the water. These areas also help to slow floodwaters and control erosion to some degree during these rain events. They provide water storage and aquifer recharge for the summer low flow conditions that we face in Oregon. They filter sediment, provide shade to stream, which of course helps with fish and wildlife habitat. And so we developed the Pure Water Partners program a number of years ago with a variety of local agencies and organizations, some of which are represented here tonight. And the purpose of the Pure Water Partners program is really to reward good stewardship through payments to landowners who agree to maintain their healthy riparian areas over a long period of time. We have 15 and 20-year agreements. And then we also help to facilitate restoration on other properties that need additional work to bring them up to a more healthy status, if you will. So our primary focus is on protection of healthy riparian forests, which is much more cost effective than restoration after an area is degraded. But we also recognize that, of course, with the Holiday Farm fire, you know, there's a lot of riparian areas that are obviously in much different condition than they were before the fire. So we've kind of reoriented our program to address those areas as well. Another goal of the program is to really align funding from watershed partners, from grants, private funding, and take all of this different funding and combine it and make sure that we allocate it where it can do the most good on the ground in an effective and efficient manner. So we have 4 different pathways now for the Pure Water Partners program. I talked about the protection and restoration pathways. We have a revegetation pathway that we just developed post-fire, where we're helping landowners replant in the riparian areas. And we also have naturescaping, which is the focus of tonight's presentation, and that's basically incentives and technical assistance that we provide for landowners along the river or tributaries. And this is aimed at kind of smaller, 1 or 2 acreage or less properties. So naturescaping, and Chris will talk about this a little bit more, but it's essentially a landscaping method that places a lot of emphasis on using native plants to conserve water, to reduce chemical and fertilizer use. And this also helps to create wildlife habitat, and also taking into account how you as a landowner would like your property to look and how you would like to use it. And essentially, it can save you a lot of time and money and energy while protecting water quality and wildlife habitat. And that's because native plants take so much less kind of effort to maintain because they are so well suited for our climate and precipitation regime. So what we offer through Pure Water Partners is this Naturescaping pathway, which is a voluntary, completely voluntary agreement. So you would basically sign an informal agreement, and it's for 7 years. And what this involves is you, as a landowner, would receive up to 2 hours of an initial consultation with the Watershed Council or Upper Willamette Soil and Water Conservation District. And then if you want to develop a specific naturescaping plan, EWEB will pay 50% of that cost, up to $250. You get additional technical assistance and site visits after implementation to answer questions, and one-time free invasive removal services by the Northwest Youth Corps. So this has been pretty popular. Basically, they send crews out and they'll be on your property for half a day or a day to do any kind of invasive removal that's applicable to your property. And you also have some access to wholesale native plant nursery stock and reduced prices. So this is the Naturescaping pathway that we've set up through the Pure Water Partners program. But again, it's voluntary. So, you can also just kind of do things on your own, attend these workshops, download the resources on our website, and that's fine too. And speaking of resources, these are the kind of resources we have on our Pure Water Partners website under the Naturescaping resources. So we have the Naturescaping guide, which you see in the top right-hand corner, which is a detailed booklet that goes through all the kinds of concepts that Chris will be talking about tonight and provides additional resources. We have native plant and invasive plant posters that you can download that gives you a lot of examples of the types of plants that are helpful for planting in this area. We have a revegetation and planting guide when you're thinking about planting close to the riparian area and what kind of plants as you move away from that area, and a list of local sources for native plants. Even though this isn't directly related to naturescaping, I just wanted to mention a few of the programs that EWEB has for holiday farm fire landowners. We have a home site relocation program right now for rebuilding. If you're willing and able to rebuild your home further from the river, basically outside of the riparian setback or floodplain area, we're able to provide up to $7,000 of grant funding to help you accomplish that. We also have a septic system zero interest loan program that you're welcome to apply for if you need to make major repairs or replace your septic system, put in alternative treatment, and that loan amount is up to $20,000. And then of course we have the Pure Water Partners program that I've been talking about. In addition, I just wanted to bring your attention to the Lane County Firewise Grant Incentive Program. This was just released in the last couple of days. They got additional funding. And as a landowner, you can apply for this program, and you can potentially get up to $15,000 to implement practices on your property, such as replacing roofing material, creating better access to your driveway, creating defensible space around your home, and things like that. So this just opened. Applications are due on May 28th, and there's the link if you're interested in finding out more information and applying for that program. And then my contact information as well is up there, and you're also welcome to email us at info@purewaterpartners.org, and one of us will get back to you with any questions. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Justin Patton from Oregon Department of Forestry to talk a little bit more in depth about Firewise landscaping.
All right, bear with me for a second while I share my screen. All right, everybody see that okay? Okay. All right, so I'm Justin Patton from Oregon Department of Forestry, the Eastern Lane District. I've been in fire for about 12 years, and I'm here tonight to talk to you guys about some of the things that you guys can do to better prepare for fire around your homes and some of the landscaping choices that you can make. There we go. So some of the learning objectives for tonight. So we're going to identify some terms that we use, the home ignition zone, and define what we mean when we're talking about defensible space. We're going to understand the principles of the home ignition zone and defensible space. Talk about some of the strategies that you guys can use to reduce your risk. And then we're going to talk about some of the differences between fire resistant and more fire prone landscaping. Just some real basics to start with. So 3 elements that are required for fire: heat, fuel, and oxygen. Remove one of those, you're not going to have a fire. We have what we call the fire behavior triangle. And this is really what impacts how fast and how severe a fire burns. You can see things such as topography, which is terrain, aspect, position on a slope, things like weather, wind, relative humidity, temperature, and those things you really can't change. But the third element really determines how fire burns is fuel, and that's something that we can affect. Some of the things that we look at: fuel moisture, fuel characteristics like the continuity and arrangement, the quality of fuel, the availability, and we'll kind of talk about a little the quality and availability with some more slides here. So these are just kind of some of the examples of things that can be considered fuel. So on the left, you can see a picture of some arborvitae after the holiday farm fire. On the right, this is what they would have looked like before. They look fairly green on the outside. But one of the general trends that we'll talk about tonight, anything that has a lot of dead fuel buildup is something you're going to want to avoid. In this upper picture here, you can see there's a lot of small conifer trees in here. These are the sorts of things that you're going to want to thin out, prune up, and kind of reduce the amount of those. But there's a lot of things, native plants such as vine maple, hazels, that really, you can have quite a few of them in the understory, and they're really not going to pose a lot more fire risk. And we'll get into a little bit more details of this as we go. Just some more examples of some fuel. So in this picture, you can kind of see an example of what we call ladder fuels. And it's kind of exactly how it sounds. It's a way for a fire that's burning on the ground to climb up into the canopies of the trees. And the reason that that's a problem as firefighters, once we have a crown fire or a canopy fire, there's really no way that we can stop the fire. So we're really looking to target, and specifically, like I mentioned, the dead fuels, conifer branches, things of that nature that have a lot of oils. Another big one, and if you guys were here for the first presentation, we talked about invasives. In the fire area, invasives are going to be a big struggle for the coming years. Things like blackberries are a big problem, English ivy, for a couple of reasons. Both the ivy burns fairly well itself, and it also traps a lot of that dead material that you're not able to clean out. And then another category is going to be urban fuels. And this, unfortunately, at times can include homes, but it's going to be, anything, plastic products, vehicles, anything that's combustible, that's man-made. So as far as there's been a lot of research as to how and why most homes burn, and there's usually a large misconception. People think that, it's a giant wall of flame that comes up and directly contacts the structure. And that's the case in a small percentage of homes being burned, but the biggest is going to be direct flame contact. And a lot of times it's actually going to be low intensity, just kind of a creeping fire next to the home, or the number one biggest problem is going to be burning embers or firebrands. And those can be blown, it's not uncommon to have firebrands that get blown up to half a mile. And in extreme cases, you can get some ignitions up to 1 mile to 2 miles away from a fire from these firebrands. So you really have to protect against those. So you may have heard the term defensible space. It's one that we use in fire prevention a lot. So the defensible space is basically just the area between your home and the native, unmodified vegetation. And this is the area where firefighters are going to be able to come in and safely protect a home if there's a fire burning around it. It's important to consider, though, in instances such as the holiday farm fire, large fires, that the amount of resources we have as firefighters are going to be quickly overwhelmed, and there may not be enough engines or personnel to go to every home. So we have to rely on the landowners to do their best to prepare their home for the greatest chance of success. Another term, the home ignition zone. So this is a concept that was developed by a Forest Service fire scientist, Jack Cohen, in the late 1990s. And it's basically, he was going to some of the large fires around mostly the western United States that had a large number of structures lost in these wildfires, and really looking into the details of how the homes were lost. So some of the details of the home ignition zone. So it's going to include the home itself and everything around it out to 100 feet. So in some extreme cases, if you have a steeper slope or a lot of topography, it can extend out to as far as 200 feet beyond the structure, and especially on the downslope side. So within this home ignition zone, there's going to be 3 primary zones. We'll talk about the differences. The most critical for people to focus on, and oftentimes the most overlooked, is going to be this zone 1 from 0 to 30 feet from the home. And of that, the most critical is going to be creating a fire-free area within 5 feet of the home. Now, what I mean by this is it's going to be 5 feet of the home, decks, or anything flammable that's attached. And what you're going to be looking for is something such as bare mineral soil, round rock, or something of that nature that's non-combustible. People like to put bark mulch and stuff like that in this area. The problem with that, you can have firebrands that land in that, get some, glowing or smoldering ignitions, which can then lead to the spread to the deck into the house. Another consideration, people oftentimes have those flower beds with the bark mulch and they irrigate them. But unfortunately, in a large fire situation, if you're in a rural area, you're likely not going to have power, likely not going to have water. And in a situation where you have to evacuate, you may be gone for multiple days, and under harsh conditions like the holiday farm fire with super low humidities, that bark mulch will dry out over a day or two and become available to burn. So I would just throw that out there for caution. So like I said, that the biggest key is that 5 feet immediately around the home, as well as, on your roofs, on your decks, where all the small material gathers, and we'll get into that a little bit later. That's not to say you can't have a few plants in this area. If you have some succulents or something low growing that doesn't have a lot of dead material buildup, then you maybe will have a few things, but just keep them spaced out. Don't have a large buildup in this area. You're going to want to space your conifer trees. If you have large conifer trees, you don't necessarily have to take them all out. They provide shade and some good benefits, but you do want to prune them up. And we like to see, 10 feet of clearance around the roof and the house. And if you have a chimney, at least 15 feet of clearance from the, the closest branches. The biggest thing that those large conifers are going to pose is going to be all the needles and stuff that they're going to drop. So it's going to be more of a maintenance issue if you keep the large trees. But you certainly don't have to take them all out. So just kind of continuing. So here's a picture of a home up in the Blue River area that we came in and did some fuels reduction. So you can see there's still some, small conifers, some ferns, some Oregon grape, some large mature trees. And this is after the fuels reduction. You can see the chips here. This home, the fire burned completely around it. And the direct fire did not make contact. You can see they have a pretty good clear area all the way around the home. And there was a high intensity fire that burned just everywhere around here. And, all this fuel in the picture was consumed, but they had enough separation between the home to prevent it from being ignited. We'll talk about some more details on this home as we move forward. A couple of other things you really want to watch out for, though. Firewood stacks and propane tanks should not be in this zone. You're probably not going to, if you have a large propane tank as a supply for your home, you may not go out and move it tomorrow. But if it's within this zone or wherever it's at close to a home, make sure you clear any of the flammable debris from the area so that it doesn't get subject to a big heat source. And the firewood stacks, I understand people don't like to walk out in the pouring rain to get firewood in the wintertime. So maybe there's a spot on the deck or the porch where you can keep a small amount of firewood throughout that time. But starting, this time of year or as things dry out, get that stuff out away from the house, have your woodshed 30 feet or more from the structure. And I can't stress enough how much or how important the annual maintenance of cleaning those fine debris immediately around and on top of the structure is. So here's just kind of some examples, where leaves and needles gather, soaking embers. Here's another picture of that home that I showed with the fuels reduction earlier. So they did have some minor ignitions on the home. So this is where some embers landed in the gutter, and the needles from those mature trees ignited, and had there not been a fire engine around that extinguished the fire, the home would have been completely lost just due to a small ember ignition. So there's a good example of how the small details matter. Some of the strategies you can use to keep stuff from building up underneath the decks, screen to block off the needles and the leaves from getting in there. You're going to want to use a mesh metal screen. When you're screening things like this, I would just urge people to take some consideration, and when they put these screens in, be able to remove them, because there's ultimately still going to be some material that gets behind it. So if you can pull that back and get a leaf blower or something in there to clean things out, that's optimal. So zone 2, this is as you're kind of working your way out, from 30 feet out to 100 feet around the home. On this area, you're still going to want to have, plants in this area, be fairly low, well irrigated and less flammable. As Nancy mentioned, some of the natives, you don't really need to irrigate them, and they can kind of maintain that healthy fire resistance as it is. So some plant choice there can save you some efforts. You can kind of start to leave some clusters of plants and stuff, but again, you're still going to want to avoid anything that has a lot of dead fuel buildup or oils and resin, and we'll get into some more of those characteristics you're going to look to avoid here in a little bit. And these are some of the plants. We'll get into more details on that. You can create some fuel breaks with your landscaping, such as driveways, gravel pathways, or lawns. Prune your trees up 10 feet from the ground is what we like to recommend. That being said, with smaller trees, you're not going to want to go over half the tree height at a time. So if you have a 4 or 5 foot tall tree, you're not going to want to, prune it all the way up. Just kind of as they grow, slowly take them up from the ground. And that, again, that's just to keep a fire burning on the ground and to keep it out of the canopies of trees. If you have a dense stocking of the small conifers, you're going to want to remove them. Or if they're underneath more dominant trees and they're suppressed, that's good for both forest health and just kind of reducing the overall fuels. Remove your heavy accumulations of woody debris. Reduce the density of tall trees in certain areas so the canopies aren't touching. And I want to also point out some of the native hardwoods around here, such as big leaf maple, alder, anything with those sorts of characteristics can actually provide a good barrier in the canopy to crown fire, because those plants are going to stay a lot more moist and the fire is not going to carry through those. And removing your dead and dying trees from this zone. Here's just some examples of some of that fire or some of the landscaping, a rock retaining wall. You can see your gravel path here to kind of break up that continuous fuel. So access considerations, we talked about the home. If you have a driveway, or when you're at your driveway, if you look out or you're on the main road looking in, you have to picture that landscape if it were on fire. If you're a firefighter or if you're in the home and a fire's coming through, are you going to want to drive through there? Those are the decisions we have to make. So we need to do some clearing around the driveway. And here again, we're not looking for you to take out all your trees by any means, but we do need them pruned up. We like to see the driveway width of 12 feet at least and clearance of 13.5 feet. This is going to be for larger vehicles, structural engines, tenders that bring a lot of water. But this also can be accessed for, ambulances, things of that nature. And if you have that 12 feet and 13.5 feet clearance, beyond that, we like to see at least 10 feet from the center line on either side of the road where it's kind of modified, less brush, less flammable material. And that's just to lower the intensity of a fire as it burns up towards the road, allow firefighter access, and homeowner to get out in the event of a fire. And then having a clearly marked address sign that's reflective is optimal. So snags can be valuable habitat, but just be aware that they can also ignite and spew embers that create new spot fires. So within that 100 feet of the home, at a minimum, you're not going to want anything, dead like a snag or something. As you move out from that distance, you may be able to have a few here and there without greatly increasing your risk. But what you're going to want to do if you keep them is making sure you're kind of clear the area around them. Maybe at the base of the tree, you can clear it down to bare mineral soil so a fire can't physically burn up and ignite a snag or something like that. Some other things for wildlife. So, in that first 30 feet around the home, like I mentioned, maybe you can plant some succulent plants, right there immediately around the home, maybe have some sort of a water feature. Once you start going out beyond the 30 feet, you can leave some patches for some cover. Just remember to avoid, a lot of dead fuel buildup. Still no snags in this zone. Once you get out beyond that 100 feet, you can slowly start to leave a little bit more stuff, but still try to remove those dead fuels, the ladder fuels. Maybe you can have a few snags here and there. Another thing that I didn't mention, you can leave some larger dead down material. If it's, something 8 to 10 inches or larger, say a tree falls down, the biggest risk is going to be those fine fuels, the branches and the smaller material. That's really going to determine how fast the fire comes in. So if you really want to leave some stuff for habitat, a tree falls over that's, out away from the home, remove all the fine fuels, the branches and stuff, and get rid of that. And you can leave a stem or a trunk of the tree without greatly increasing your risk. And as long as there's not a big accumulation of those large logs and they're spaced out. Okay, so we haven't really talked about some specific examples of what you can plant, but some of the things that you're looking for, your leaves are moist and supple, such as a vine maple or big leaf maple. Plants that have little dead wood tend not to accumulate dry dead material with the plant. But if the sap is, more watery, doesn't have a strong odor, such as a pine tree or a fir tree. So yeah, some examples: maple, oak, deciduous shrubs. Here's a link to some fire-resistant plants through OSU Extension. Here's kind of a few examples, and sorry, I'm not a professional photographer, and I kind of just took some pictures of some examples. So on the left here, you can see some vine maple. It's going to be fairly good and fire resistant as long as, over time the clumps get large. If you have snow damage or something, then they end up like this picture over here on the right. And the problem with that, you can see they trap a lot of other dead material that is flammable, and they prevent you from getting in there to clean out the other material. So more the structure of the plants in this case. This is some hazel. You're looking for plants like this. You can see there's not a lot of dead fuel buildup, nice green leaves. So some things to avoid planting near your home. So here's a picture of some manzanita. Probably not a lot of this in the McKenzie drainage. There's a little bit more as you go south. But things that build up dead material, such as this, and also have a real oily or resinous needles and leaves. So some examples: juniper, mugu pine, cedars, which are the one native in this example, are fairly susceptible to fire. And I'm not telling you to go out and remove all of your cedar trees by any means, but it's certainly important to make sure you prune them up and keep them spaced out a little bit. Boxwoods are another one that people like to plant right next to their home that are actually, they build up a lot of material and have waxy leaves. Here's an example that you'll see all over town and in people's landscaping. They look fairly green, kind of like the arborvitae, but once you lift them up, you can see all the dead material in here. So one, that dead material is able to catch embers and get things ignited, and two, the oil and resin in here makes these burn very intensely. Sword ferns, if they're well maintained, you know, you can see these nice healthy fronds on the left here. Not so much of a problem as long as they're maintained, but if you lift those up, you can see all the dead material that they build up. So it's going to come down to an annual maintenance thing, and you're not going to want these right next to your home. But you know, if they're 5 or 6 feet away from the home, you remove all the dead material, then they're going to be fairly resilient. Like I said, you know, maintenance is key with any of these plants. This is just a graphic. You know, your most important zone is going to be that area right around the home. You're going to want to pay close attention to that every year. I know it's a lot of work maintaining, you know, property in the country. So maybe maintain your area around the home every year, and then just kind of pick another piece every year and work your way around. So just kind of to recap, that non-flammable roof covering and assembly, you know, the asphalt shingles, which most people have, is going to get you that. It's going to be the clearing of the roofs, the gutters, that's going to get you the most. Keeping your decks and patios clear of that flammable debris, you know, again, leaves, needles. During high fire danger, remove your large potential heat sources. That's that firewood we were talking about. Any sort of those urban fuels, plastics, lawn furniture that's made of plastic. There's some checklists that are available at NFPA, the National Fire Prevention Association's website. And then it's important to think about having a wildfire evacuation plan. You know, if you're given 2 minutes to get out, what's important to you? Have emergency contacts. Where are you going to go? It's especially important if you have pets or livestock, or people that maybe have special needs or considerations. You know, maybe if you're put into a level 1 evacuation, maybe you start moving your livestock and those people with special needs early and often. So just be prepared, think ahead. And that's all I have for now. I think we'll probably have Chris go, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. Is that right, Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, if anybody has a immediate question while Chris is sharing his screen and stuff, please feel free. Otherwise, we will have more time at the end. Any quick questions?
Yeah, quick one. I mean, are stumps considered deadwood, or? Yeah, I mean.
It kind of depends on if you're talking something that's been recently cut, or if you're talking an old rotten stump. Old rotten stumps, especially, you know, they tend to be larger. That can be a problem if it's close to the home, for sure. The best way to kind of mitigate that, you know, oftentimes they're tough to dig out, but if you can potentially cut them low to the ground and then maybe cover them with some dirt or something to keep an ember from landing on them, is a good way to mitigate them.
All right, well, we'll turn it over to Chris now for Naturescaping basics and site design. Thanks, Justin.
There we go. So some of this is going to be a little repetitive from some of what Jennifer was talking about last week and from some of Nancy's intro, but we want to start with just kind of the basics of naturescaping, starting with, you know, why naturescape, because a lot of people, whether they're building new or just looking to landscape their place, you know, think, well, we can grow anything we want, right? There's landscape companies that'll come with a kind of a given palette of plants that they put in every landscape they do. And the question is really what's the cost of those choices? You know, a lot of ornamental landscapes have increased costs for water, for fertilizer, pesticides, just general labor. So we want to look at you know, the contrast that with the benefits of using native plants, which is what the naturescaping pathway is about. So I want to look at just the lower cost in general of the plants, buying native plants compared to often some of the patented hybrid non-native plants that you get. You can get native plants for quite a bit less. You're going to end up using less water because they're the plants that have, and you'll hear this on all these pieces, evolved with rain cycles. Even though they're changing, our native plants have the best ability to adapt and manage to our conditions. Same thing as around, you're not having to add all the additional fertilizers because they're the plants have evolved and adapted to the kind of natural detritus, the natural fertilizer fluctuation that happens in our soils. Less use of pesticides. You know, a lot of the ornamental non-native plants we bring in are really susceptible to our local bugs that because they've not grown up around them. So aphids and different things like that most of our plants have adapted to, that we have don't bother our native plants. So you're not having to use the same levels of pesticides. You also end up improving the soil stability. You know, a lot of people plant lawns, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but the root systems of our native plants are much better at stabilizing our soils. Our native plants provide habitat because at the same time as they've evolved in our area, then the native fauna have also evolved with them. And especially as you start creating more pieces of native habitat, especially at the McKenzie corridor, there you actually create corridors that the wildlife can use to travel up and down the valley. So one of the first pieces when you decide to start looking at this, and especially bringing in the pieces Justin was talking about, is looking for how much space do you need and how much open space do you want, so that you can start making decisions around how you're going to put that landscape around your house. Some of that open space might be the break between the ornamental landscape around the house and the forested or more natural area out farther, or it could be even that area right next to the house that you want to keep clear. So one of the pieces to look at in those open spaces is that, you know, it doesn't just have to be lawn. And it's one of the big pieces that Pure Water Partners tries to emphasize, is that putting these monoculture lawns uses some of the greatest input of fertilizers and water. And there's options from having native prairie plants and meadows in there, or even plants that are a little more scattered, but they're low, so they break up that fire laddering and keep, if you've got a fire coming in from the forested area, it drops it down to where it's keeps it from climbing and laddering up to the house. And then the other piece of that is that the lawn won't protect your soil. If you look at this piece here, a typical ornamental grass gets its roots between 4 and 6 inches deep, whereas many of our native prairie plants penetrate down into the 10 to 15 foot range even. So it really stabilizes that soil much differently. Another piece that a lot of the time people are fighting moss, or putting moss killers on and reseeding and worrying, trying to create these monoculture lawns. And a lot of people have started switching to actually just embracing those darker, wetter spaces, and you can actually supplement the mosses in there and create a moss garden. You can add a little buttermilk and moss in a blender and spread it on rocks and things, and it'll grow anywhere. So the next question is kind of how do you make that shift? You know, I've got, you know, some people have the tragedy of having lost their homes and or the landscape around them, and other people are just looking, how do I go from that typical ornamental into something following the Naturescape path? And it starts with just kind of planning your space, you know, looking at Where do you have a view that you want to accent? Where do you have a view that you want to block? Do you want to grow your own food? Do you want to have, you know, recreational space? Do you want to provide habitat? Kind of looking at your whole property and thinking ahead of time how you want to plan that space. And then looking around you at what's happening in the areas around you, what kind of plants are growing naturally. We kind of talk about that a little later. Get to your soil, our conservation makes it easy to take soil samples and send them in and kind of see where your soil is starting out. And if you have native early soils and you're planting our native plants, you're not really even gonna have to think about supplementing those soils. A lot of the time when there's building that goes on, they strip all the topsoil, bring in new topsoil, dirt, and you might want to get that checked to see if you want to supplement things. But the other piece of that is to just look at what the conditions are naturally. Where's the light? Where are the areas that it's already light? Where are those shaded areas that you don't want to plant a lawn because it's going to turn into a moss problem? And just kind of think ahead and work with the site. Where is it wet? Where do you naturally, you know, you look at it in the winter and you know that this is the area that tends to be bogged down and it holds the moisture farther into summer than other areas. Plant those water loving plants in the areas that tend to already be wet, as opposed to out in that exposed dry area where you're having to supplement with more water. And then again, looking at what's happened in the natural areas around you, especially at the McKenzie, it's really easy to kind of look in the forested areas that are left and look at the different plants that are there and the different associations and see what's thriving and what's happy in those conditions and pulling some of that into your yard. And then instead of just turning your yard into another forested kind of unorganized piece, you learn to kind of mimic nature but add balance. So the first piece of that is in design elements is to set up kind of the backbone of where you want your main trees, your large trees, and try and set up kind of a balance through the yard, because that's going to be the structure that where deciduous, where they're evergreen, the shape and structure of those trees is always going to be there. So it's kind of the backbone of how you're setting up your landscape. There's some examples in here from the cascara trees to our native dogwoods, and a lot of these things that people don't really even recognize are out in some of these ornamental landscapes because they're such pretty plants. So the next piece after you get those backbone plants is to add in evergreens and large focal plants. We've got our rhododendrons and our native azaleas and mock orange and red flowering currant, and a lot of our big substantial plants. And a lot of these things like red flowering currant are what hummingbirds set up their territories around. A lot of the other pollinators kind of focus in on these plants, and it'll make it an area that the birds and wildlife thrive in. Next piece is kind of filling in. And this is where you want to kind of look at what Justin was talking about as you're getting closer to the house. Think about what you're putting in. Those maples, the open kind of lush plants work pretty well and are pretty fire resistant. Things like ferns are great, but you also want to realize that a sword fern needs that little bit of maintenance. When it's a happy green fern, it's a very fire resistant plant, but those old fronds from last year become dry tinder in late spring. Right now they're changing. It's really easy to go in and just cut all those dead fronds out and let those fiddles that are coming up in the middle spring out, and you have another beautiful plant without that fire danger. So again, it's filling it in. When you're farther away from the house, you're mimicking a little bit of nature. And when you're closer to the house, you're looking at how can I make sure that I'm keeping from creating that ladder, that if there's a small little ground fire, it catches from one thing up to the next and into the house. And then finally looking at ground covers, there's things like this native oxalis, there's lily of the valley, different things like that you can do to actually green up the base around things in those ground covers. Some of the things like are the smaller of the Oregon grape actually, lays and acts more like a ground cover. And then in those open areas, you can look for weed prevention, and for water retention, you can look at mulching. And you want to look at, mulch is not a real fire prone material. It will, if it gets a spark, it will light like a cigarette and sit there and smolder. And so you do want to pay attention when you have mulch in areas. It's not a ladder fuel. It's not it doesn't turn into a flame very easily, but it's something to kind of keep an eye on. And in the natural areas, you can also, it can be the original thing you do to manage weeds and hold down moisture, but over time, it will kind of transition into that native duff of needles and things. And again, as long as you're keeping the branches and the real fire fuels up, that duff that's on the ground is not the problem. It's those things that can actually create big flame that move into shrubs and stuff. And Justin will correct me if I'm saying that at all wrong, but I think that's kind of our strategy on things. And then just looking forward, a lot of people are in dire situations and lost their homes to these fires. And it's been my favorite quote since I was really young, is to plant a garden is to believe in the future. And I think that with Jennifer and some of the work that Pure Water Partners has been doing upriver, we're over 208,000 plants that they've put in the ground as part of our restoration process from the fire, and trying to help people and encourage people to Naturescaping as they start rebuilding is really going to be a big piece of recreating a new, beautiful, McKenzie corridor going forward. And that's what anyone has questions.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, if anybody has questions, we're all here for another several minutes, so please ask away on any of the presentations.
Oh, hi.
Someone must have a question. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Bob, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Yeah, I participated and called in the resources back in October. I live on Gate Creek, and unfortunately, my home was incinerated. We put in wattles and netting, but I'm not sure if I need to reapply for any native plants or to continue the program. I'd like to participate. So maybe we can give me some guidance since you've already visited the property. I don't know if you have a history or of what's next, or if I need to take additional action.
Nancy, do you want me to take that one, or do you want to answer that?
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. What I was going to say, Bob, is that I think I've been on your property. There's been so many that we've implemented erosion control measures on. But if I recall, just off the top of my head, situations like yours where we didn't necessarily identify them for immediate revegetation this winter. So this winter would have been January through basically this week, where we're finished with our planting. For those that we didn't plant, we are going to continue to monitor, and we're actually going to be doing some invasive vegetation monitoring site visits on all of the properties that have been part of the program, as well as monitoring for invasive vegetation. We're also going to be looking at regeneration as it's been occurring naturally on those sites. And if we see that and say, okay, well, there was really, more severe burn here and we're not seeing the regeneration that we want, then we'll be identifying and communicating with landowners about potential replanting during winter 2022 for those riparian areas that have been impacted, where planting will help to protect them. Does that answer your question, or do you have more specific questions than that?
Yes, and I think there was a Jennifer that came on my property, but oddly enough, since no one's wearing masks,
It
I
was
can't
me.
recognize anyone. So I met someone the other day. They said hi, Bob, but they didn't have their mask on. I had no clue who the heck they were. So
I understand. It's pretty confusing.
yeah, so I had English ivy, and I've been ripping it out for 30 years now. And well, all that's gone. So I think I've spared the youth corps a day of work at my place. It's all gone. So I'm just not, I've been trying to find local resources for native plants, but it looks like in your opening statements there are a list of resources where I can go ahead and purchase some. So that's great. I've been looking headed that way for years now. So I'd like to, having that information is very valuable. Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And actually that brings up an additional item that, folks that are PWP participating landowners, there is, well, I should back it up. Number one, we're really at the end of planting season, especially with how dry it is currently and how dry it's been over the last month. But PWP landowners are also eligible for discounted prices, at least through Native Grounds Wholesale Nursery that's based out of Brownsville. They are willing to give wholesale prices to our participating landowners, which is a significant savings. If you are going to go that route, I would suggest waiting until the fall to plant anything, though, just because you really don't want to put anything in the ground right now, because then you're going to be fighting, having to irrigate and try and keep it from being too stressed out. It's much better if you're going to plant any container stock to wait until the fall to do that.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Do I need
if there's a,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'd just say if there's a couple of key places where you just know I want to get this kind of a plant and you've got the ability to keep them watered through the summer, that makes sense. But if you're trying to really restore the property, like Jennifer's saying, wait till you get that hopefully free water in the fall.
Okay. Do I need a voucher, or do I just mention I'm holiday farm fire victim in Brownsville, or is there anything additional I need?
I would specifically say that you're a Pure Water Partner landowner.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. And the owner there, Mike, is very helpful, and he is also happy to coordinate delivery if you have a significant amount of plants that you're ordering. He's happy to do that. There is a fee for delivery, but he has delivered upriver for other residents.
Oh, it's good to know. Thank you.
And I want to answer someone in the chat here. It's kind of sad to even think that, how long it's going to take before our lot looks like it's got a future, like it's got trees on it again. And as fast and amazing as our Doug firs are, and if you've got a lot where that's one of the things you're replanting, it's still going to be 6-8 years before you really feel like you're getting some trees in there, and longer before they're tall. So it's going to be a long haul, but kind of just, it's a good opportunity to start setting up that structure again, so that you are creating views and the blocks and everything you want as that stuff's coming in, and just keep holding on and moving forward.
Hi, Chris. This is Tish. That was my question. And I also, I was, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so that was my question. And I also wanted to know, we're on the river, and the bank opposite us was burned, and it was forested, so there's no landowner there. So what can we expect going forward on burned banks that won't be having anybody regenerate. I mean, I'm assuming will trees just fall down and it will eventually have no trees on it? Or no one's been able to tell me what to expect from that situation. So can you give me an idea of what to expect?
Patricia, is that the BLM parcel on the other side of the river across from you that you're thinking of?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that I don't know. So we've also been in talks with the BLM about revegetation in some of the areas along the river for the parcels that they own. Ultimately, they were right now in a position of really being focused on hazard tree removal adjacent to roadways and in public spaces. I do expect that that's going to be an ongoing conversation with them over, the next several months, and having those discussions with them. We're particularly concerned about the south side of the river where, you have those greatest thermal impacts into the river when you lose shade like that. So, unfortunately, I don't necessarily have an answer of how soon that's going to happen, but I do want you to know that it is something that is being discussed, and it is not just being, just left as it is.
Jennifer, when you say it's being discussed, you mean replanting the areas that were burned?
Yes.
And that BLM, they'll be replanting it for a natural landscape, correct?
That is what I have heard from conversations. I can't guarantee what's going to happen at this point, just because they are still discussing that, and they do have, as a federal agency, they have pretty strict guidelines about sourcing for plant material and whether they grow it out from their own seed sources. They do have nursery facilities where they are able to produce plant materials. So, what I would say is it's coming down the pipeline. I don't know when it's going to happen, but it is those talks are happening.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm sorry, I don't have a more concrete answer for you.
That's better than what I had before, so that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
There was another question in the chat from Tommy. Does anyone need help with volunteer cleanup? Do you mean of materials or plants, invasives, or? Can see you, but not hear you yet. Looks like you're on mute, Tommy.
Oh, he says in the text though, said, sorry, clearing debris.
Debris. Oh, got it. I guess that's a question for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. And I was gonna say, I don't, about, there may be individuals, but there have been like other organizations like Cascade Relief Team that have been doing work like that, who have been asking for volunteers for that. And I know that they've been very helpful with clearing for many folks.
Jen, what about revegetation across the river from me? That slope over there is extremely steep. Is there any hope? And it's totally brown. There's nothing green over there right now.
On the other side of the river, on the other side of 126.
On the other side of the river.
Okay.
Just by Eagle Rock, you should go downriver from Eagle Rock. It's just totally brown. It even burned the lichen off the rock.
Yeah.
Is there anything that can be done?
Is that also BLM over there? Or?
I believe there's a narrow strip of BLM that goes down right from the ridge down to the river. Behind that is private timberland, I believe.
Yeah. And yeah, and as far, I mean, I was gonna say maybe Justin can talk to the private timberlands. I know that there's been a seedling shortage.
Yeah.
I can't really talk about what their requirements are, but like I said, you know, the BLM piece is you know, it's definitely still under discussion.
Yeah, as far as from private timberlands, you know, if they harvest, they're required to replant areas. With a fire, there's not necessarily a strict requirement for them to replant the area. But in most cases, you know, the timber company is going to want to get as many trees in the ground as they can. There is certainly a major seedling shortage currently. And, you know, we kind of mentioned a lot of areas have been replanted, but they're seeing severe mortality in those areas that were planted. And, you know, if it's an area that's really looks really burned and you're not seeing any green, they're probably going to choose to plant other areas that they're going to have higher success rates first. And I wouldn't say that I would say they're probably going to eventually plant those areas. But the ground's probably going to take some time to recover. And those will probably be some of the later areas that are planted, would be my guess.
Yeah, and you know, we are, you know, as one of the folks on the implementation team that's been up there, you know, on a near daily basis since early October. You know, I absolutely acknowledge how stark and different the landscape is, and how hard it is to see something that was once so just verdant and lush. And it's not even my home, and it still breaks my heart. So I absolutely acknowledge you know, just the depth of how hard that must be. And you know, I'm really heartened by seeing all of the alder that are leafing out along the river. And you know, that's definitely giving me some hope. Seeing all of the ferns and you know, even the snowberry that's coming back in a lot of places. You know, I think the regeneration that we're going to see by the end of the, you know, summertime, those, you know, those native plants that thrive in those dry summer conditions. I think that, you know, I'm hoping, I think, and I hope that we're all going to feel a little bit better after seeing that regeneration. But at the same time, I also, you know, absolutely agree that there are going to be spots that need support and assistance with that revegetation effort. And, you know, we have already put in a plant order for 2022, as well as winter 2023. And we actually were able to source a larger number of plants for those years than we were this year. And this year we were able to leverage our connections and get over 200,000 plants in the ground. So next year, hopefully, it'll be double that. And same with the year after. So we're,
well, I think one of the really heartening things is that it's amazing how much green has come back. And I agree with you completely. It is the natives that are in particular proving to be very resilient. My driveway was lined on both sides by sword fern, and it completely burned off. It was just brown dirt, and they're back. And that one just kind of shocked me. But it's amazing how much is coming back. There's still a lot that's going to have to be cut down, though. Now that you can see what's leafing out and what isn't, there's still a whole lot out there that's just going to have to be cut back. But.
And following up on some of Jennifer's work from last week, you know, the other thing that's resilient is the invasive weeds. And part of the plan for Pure Water Partners is doing early detection, rapid response of weeds that are colonizing in these areas. But it's something you can do as a homeowner too, is to be looking for where are those blackberries popping back up that used to be a giant mound? It looks like they're gone, but they're going to come back quick and hard. But it's kind of an opportunity to get in there and rub some of those out while you can get to them, and find some of the patches so that your native plants have more of a chance against them.
Oh, and-
Actually, I was going to ask you a fire question about fencing. While this lot is deep, the noise from the highway now is just staggering. So I am going to put up a fence. My question is, but it will be a couple 100 feet away from the house. I mean, it's, going to be as close to the highway as they'll let me put it. Is there anything in particular about materials you can say for fencing that you would recommend or not recommend?
If you're talking that far away from the home, typically fence boards are going to be made out of cedar, just because of their durability to the weather. They are fairly flammable, but it's really only going to be a risk, or the biggest problem is if you have it continuously come up and it's attached to the home or the buildings. If that's not the case and you're talking a few 100 feet, I wouldn't be too worried about your fencing material. I would go with whatever makes the most sense.
I have seen people
Good
use
question.
charboard. I was just gonna say, I've seen people use charboard on their fences. When you torch the outside of those cedar panels, and it creates a charred surface on them. You can then kind of brush that down with a metal brush. That charred surface is much more resistant to fire than a raw board. People do it on house siding that build cedar houses in fire-prone areas and stuff too. But I've seen that done on fence work, and it can be quite beautiful, and it's a little bit more fire resistant.
Hold on, I'm reading the chat.
Can I ask a continuing, I think, Justin, how far should a cedar fence be away from the house? How many feet should we absolutely not have it within? What's that zone?
I would say probably within 5 feet would be a good general rule of thumb. And so, a lot of times you're going to have a gate or something that attaches close to a home. And if you can make a metal gate or put something just that's non-flammable, that last section, to kind of break up the, just the direct flame contact. Because from a cedar fence board, you're not going to get a real large flame length. It's just kind of a slow, continuous chain to the house, and you're just looking to break that up.
Thank you. You just settled an argument between my husband and me, and he won.
Oh, no.
Another consideration there, if you do have a gate close to the home, if you have to evacuate, you have some time, open your gate, make sure you open it in a way that, wind or something's not gonna close it back up, and that may be enough to create that break in the link.
Reed is offering Trillium to anybody who would like some. Must be really beautiful to see all those.
Oh, that was my favorite hillside. It was so sad when it burned, but the ferns and the trilliums came back, but most of the Doug firs are dead, are going to die. So we're just going to take them out. It's about 7-acre hillside.
Oh, wow.
But I don't think the trilliums, because we're going to change the environment, will survive. That's kind of what we've been figuring out, but maybe.
Boy, they're really deep. They come up from really surprisingly deep. Like fawn lilies are 8-10 inches down and pop up every year. So I don't know. They also tend to come up just in the spring when there's that residual soil moisture, do their thing, and then drop out anyway. So I've seen places like in town where in Hendricks Park, where there were areas that was all ivy for 20 years, and they had crews go through and remove the ivy, and these were in areas with no trees, and the trillium popped back. They almost did not realize that they existed there, and they've really thrived ever since, and it's slowly kind of canopying in around there because they did some tree planting. But I think they'll do better, not to stop from giving any away, but I think they'll do better than you might think, hopefully.
Well, that's good news, but like I said, there's a couple thousand on the hillside, so I think a few won't be a big deal.
It's probably beautiful.
It was.
Yeah.
It was sort of pretty this year in a weird burnt way. Yeah, the trilliums were the first thing that came back on the hillside. It was very bizarre.
We've definitely been seeing a lot of trillium out on properties that experienced moderate to even severe burn. And then also, of course, morels, lots of morels all over the place.
Well, any other questions?
I have one more thing to add. I realized that I did not include my contact information in my presentation. And we do have a fuels reduction program. And as part of that, I would be happy to try to come out to any of the homeowners that are interested and give them a fire assessment. And that would be at no cost to the landowners. Or if, you're unfortunate enough to have lost your home and you're rebuilding, maybe you want to talk over some of the things that you might be able to do to prepare your home for the future as you rebuild. Feel free to reach out to me. My cell phone number is 541-912-7308.
Thanks, Justin.
Yep.
And along those lines, I just wanted to mention that we will continue to have these workshops from time to time. We're thinking of having one in the fall, actually, and we've been working with the U of O landscape architecture program. They did a studio class in the winter, working with some folks in Good Pasture Road area on kind of re-envisioning landscapes. And what they're doing for us over the summer is they're going to put together like a guide with some examples of kind of how to incorporate both naturescaping that we've been talking about with Firewise landscaping. So hopefully by fall, we should have some kind of booklet or handout that we can give to folks, and you can see actual examples of designs. So stay tuned for that coming up. And yeah, I guess with that, thank you all for coming tonight. Really appreciate it. And we will be posting this recording on our Pure Water Partners website as well. So thanks, everyone.